So we just finished looking at cellular anatomy, and most of the course is going to be looking at organ systems. But in between cellular anatomy and organ systems is this area of tissues. Tissues are when cells that are similar in character come together to perform a function. And what we're going to see is we're going to look at basically four different kinds of tissue, and we're going to see how those four different kinds of tissue show up over and over again in all of the organ systems that we look at for the rest of the course. If we look at the study of tissue, and I apologize for the markings. I tried to get them off and wasn't able to, so I will do markings in a different color and hopefully it won't be too confusing. But histology is the study of tissues. So typically we're talking about what do tissues look like under the microscope. For example, if we're looking for cancer cells, we're going to look at tissue samples. When you get a biopsy for a tumor somewhere, they take that piece of tissue and they put it on a slide and they stain it and they look for signs of cancer cells in the tissue. So we do this all the time clinically in a process called histology. And we're going to look at some slides ourselves in class. And so we'll become familiar with what these major tissue types look like under the microscope. So there's four primary tissue types: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Because we're going to have a separate unit on muscles and a separate unit on the nervous system, we're not going to focus too much on those in this course. Just remember that they are part of these four primary types of tissue. We will spend quite a bit of time looking at epithelial tissue and connective tissue. What we're going to see when we go through the rest of the course is that, let's say we're studying the brain. So the brain obviously is going to have nervous tissue, but we're going to also find epithelial tissue in the brain. We're going to find connective tissue in the brain. And so we're going to find these multiple tissue types showing up in several organ systems, probably pretty much all of the organ systems that we look at. So let's look first at epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is going to be several different types that we'll look at, and we'll talk about them here, and then when we get together in class, we'll actually look at them together under the microscope, and you guys will do some drawings of them so that you can become familiar with the different types of epithelial tissue. But in general, epithelial tissue is going to cover pretty much every exposed area of your body. So your skin, for example, is going to have epithelial tissue. Glands, like salivary glands, for example, sebaceous glands, lots of different glands are going to have epithelial tissue. Your respiratory tract, your GI tract. Just think about anything that has contact with the outside world, right? So your gastrointestinal tract, you have mouth and anus are open to the world. Respiratory tract, you have nose and mouth open to the world. Reproductive tract, urinary tract, these are also open to the world. So epithelia is going to function as a covering to that, which will be like a barrier between the outside world and deeper tissues of the body. So it's going to do things like protect. It's also going to control permeability. So for example, what I mean by that, when we get to gastrointestinal system and renal system in physiology, you're going to see how it's the epithelial cells that line the lumen, the tube, that are going to decide which substances that are flowing through the tube actually get absorbed. They're going to be absorbed through these epithelial tissue. So they're going to control permeability. Epithelial cells will also be involved with some of the nervous tissue that we look at, and they will help provide sensation. And then, of course, they're also going to produce secretions, as we talked about with glands. When we get to other endocrine organs, you're going to see that it's epithelial cells that are producing a lot of the hormones and other secretions that our body makes. So let's look at kind of a general epithelial anatomy. Now, this is showing you a picture of what we would call columnar epithelium. And we call it columnar because, as you can see, it kind of looks like a column. But it's just going to serve as a representative for pretty much all of the epithelial cells that we'll take a look at. So first of all, epithelial cells tend to be bound together rather tightly so that they can form a sheet on top of whatever it is that they're covering or protecting. Um, Epithelial cells are going to have what we call polarity. Think of polarity as the north and south poles, right? The top of the earth and the bottom of the earth, as if there was such a thing as a top and bottom on the earth. But you know what I'm saying. The ends of the earth we call the North Pole and we call the South Pole. So the earth has polarity. In the same way, we're going to talk about polarity in a cell. And what we're going to see is that the apical side of the cell is going to be the side that either faces the outside, like in skin cells, for example, or that faces the lumen, let's say in the renal tubule or in the small intestine. So the side that's facing the tube is going to be apical, and the side of the cell that's kind of facing or attached to the deeper tissue, that's going to be the basal surface. And then on the sides, we might call that lateral. So we typically call, all of this from here to here, we're going to call basolateral. And this portion here, we're going to call apical. All epithelial cells have to be somehow anchored or attached to the underlying tissue. And they're going to have stem cells, somewhere in the mix of the tissue. And like we talked about with, we will talk about with skin, in the deeper areas of the epithelia of the skin, you find some basal cells that are producing new skin cells. So that as old skin cells die off and get sloughed off, you have to have a process of providing new cells. So pretty much all epithelial tissue is going to have these stem cells, which will eventually divide and become new epithelial cells. There are some specialized epithelia that I just wanted to mention. I talked about microvilli and cilia in an earlier lecture, and this is just showing them again, but now in the context of epithelia. So epithelial cells that are in the small intestine, for example, are going to be lined with microvilli because the small intestine the function of the small intestine is to absorb nutrients that are flowing through the lumen of the small intestine. So having microvilli increases surface area for absorption, and so it's a very useful structure to have on epithelial cells in places like the small intestine. Urinary system is similar in that it is absorbing and secreting various substances we'll talk about in physiology. So it's useful to have microvilli in the urinary system as well. Cilia, on the other hand, we talked, these are really designed to help move things along, and so we talked about earlier that in the respiratory system it moves mucus up and out, and in the fallopian tubes of the female it helps move the eggs through the fallopian tube. Okay, so epithelia are going to be a protective surface, kind of a sheet or a layer of protective cells pretty much along every opening that we have with our external environment. But we have to have a way of connecting neighboring cells together so that these cells don't just function as individual cells, but they function as tissue. They function as a group of cells that are performing the same function. Excuse me. So to do that, they use several substances. Some of them are proteins. Some of them are a combination of proteins and carbohydrates in order to hold neighboring cells together. So there are things called cell adhesion molecules, and these are going to be projections from the plasma membrane from one cell that attach to a neighboring cell. You're going to have cell junctions. We talked about some of these already back in the cellular chapter when we talked about gap junctions and tight junctions, for example. Those were cell junctions. And those are usually also caused by different proteins that attach from one cell to another. And there's also some intercellular cement. It's this kind of combination of sugar and protein mixed together that we would call proteoglycans, and it kind of fills the space in between the cells so that those cells are more tightly bound together. The reason that we need our epithelial cells to be tight is because they're acting as protection, right? They're acting as a barrier. That means we want them to be tightly bound so that substances are not able to leak in between the cells and get into the deeper tissues. We also often need these sheets of epithelial cells to provide some kind of a stretchability. So when we talk about the skin, for example, if you'll take a piece of your skin between your fingers and kind of pinch it, tent it up, and you can move that skin around, and you don't hurt the skin, right? So it's able to be twisted and stretched and brushed and moved without causing harm to it. And most epithelial tissues are going to have that property of being able to be flexible without being destroyed. Okay, we also need to be able to make sure that the epithelial tissue is not only bound to neighboring cells, but that it's bound to the underlying tissue. So that, for example, again in your skin, so that the top layer of skin doesn't just kind of roll around and is not actually attached to the underlying tissue. You want that epithelia to be attached to the tissue that it's protecting. So to do that, often there's something called a basement membrane. So on the basal side of the epithelial cells, there'll be a layer of connective tissue that binds the epithelial cells on top to the underlying tissue below. And that's separated into two types of tissue. There's the basal lamina and there's the reticular lamina. And I'm not going to really require you to really know the differences there. Just know that there's a basement membrane that attaches the epithelia to the underlying deeper tissue. And that's important to make sure that the epithelia can do its job as a protection. Okay, so as the epithelia kind of contact the external environment, whether that's on the skin or that's in some kind of tube, invariably some of those cells will become damaged, or they'll just become old and get worn out and need to be replaced. And the way that we replace mature cells is with something called stem cells. So stem cells are another word we might use as progenitor cells. They're kind of earlier cells. They haven't become a kind of complete mature finished product yet. They are able to still divide, replicate, make more copies of themselves. And stem cells occur at multiple layers. So what we're talking about here with epithelia basically are down here at this lower level here. We have stem cells, meaning that they can still divide, they can still replicate, and they can still replace mature cells that are dying. But we're not talking about cells that can become, like skin cells, for example, that could become nervous tissue, or skin cells that could become heart tissue. We're talking about skin cells that all they can ever be are skin cells. That's kind of down here at the lowest level. Up at a higher level, we have stem cells that could become all kinds of tissue. So if you just think for a moment, when a egg and a sperm unite and a zygote is formed, that one-celled organism that results from the connection of a sperm and egg, that one cell has within it the potential, the power, the ability to become every type of tissue that will ever be in your body, right? Your whole body came from that one cell. So that one cell, we would say, is totipotent. Toti as in total. Like it can become anything. It has the power. Think of potent as power, right? It has the power to become anything it wants. From that totipotent cell, however, once it begins to replicate and divide, it begins to have less ability to become anything. Now, there's a type of stem cell in between that we might call pluripotent. That means it has the power to become many things, but not all things. So maybe it has the power to become all types of connective tissue. Maybe it has power to become several types of muscle. Maybe it has power to become both red cells and white cells in your blood. So it's not quite differentiated into these final stem cells, but it's also not as adaptable as a totipotent cell. So for the remainder of this course, really, when we talk about stem cells, we're talking about down here at this level. We're talking about stem cells that have already differentiated into the type of tissue that they will become. So if we're talking about stem cells in the skin, they can only become skin cells. If we're talking about stem cells in the muscle, they can only become muscle cells. The reason we call them stem cells is because they retain the ability to divide and replicate. So when we talk about epithelia, we usually talk about 2 or 3 components. First, we talk about how many layers is the epithelia. Is it just a single layer? Then we would call that simple. Or are there multiple layers of epithelia between the outside world and the underlying tissue? In that case, we would call it stratified. The other thing we look at is the shape of the epithelial cells. Are they flat? If they're very flat, then we call them squamous. If they're shaped like a cube, we would call that cuboidal. And if they're shaped kind of like a rectangle, a tall rectangle, we would call that columnar. So the picture we were looking at earlier, that was really an example of a columnar epithelium. And then we can kind of combine these. We can combine different types of epithelia even in the same tissue sometimes. And the shape of the epithelia, as well as the whether they're simple or stratified, meaning whether they're single layer or they're multiple layer, really we're going to see serves a particular purpose. So for example, let's say we want fast diffusion of gases from the lungs into the capillaries that are surrounding the alveoli in the lungs. Then we want something that's very thin. We don't want a columnar epithelium. Let's just say, for example, here, let's say I've got oxygen here, and I've got blood flowing here, and I want that oxygen to get into the blood, right? If I have columnar epithelium, then that oxygen has to travel all that distance through the columnar epithelium. But let's say, on the other hand, I have a very flat squamous epithelium. Notice how quickly the oxygen could diffuse through that squamous cell and into the blood supply. So what we're going to find is when we want quick absorption, quick diffusion, we're going to have single-celled, so we're going to have a simple epithelia, and we're more than likely going to have squamous. So we're going to see this, for example, in the alveoli, as I mentioned. We're going to see this in the lining of capillaries, because capillaries want the ability to diffuse quickly in and out of the blood, for material to diffuse quickly in and out of the blood. So we'll find squamous, simple squamous epithelia in places like the lungs and blood vessels. On the other hand, let's say you're producing mucus. Let's say you're in the lungs, and you want to produce mucus in order to kind of trap debris that makes its way down into the bronchi. And so if you were a thin cell like that, you wouldn't have any space to store the mucus that you're making. However, if you were a nice, tall, columnar epithelium, you would have lots of space to store all of that mucus that you are making. So we're going to find when we get to respiratory tissue that those goblet cells that are producing mucus, those are going to be a type of columnar cell. We're also going to find cuboid is used a lot for production. So a lot of cells that make hormones, for example, are going to be cuboid. And again, it just gives them the ability to store the material that they're making. When would you need stratified, for example? Stratified squamous epithelium would be if you wanted more protection, right? The more layers that you have, the more protection that's going to give. So when we get to skin, we're going to see that skin has a very, the skin especially on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, that skin is going to be stratified squamous. It's going to be several layers of squamous cells to help protect the inside of your body from the environment that we touch every day with our hands. So you can see how both the shape and whether it's simple or stratified really have a lot to do with the function of those particular epithelial cells. So we're going to go through here quickly, and you can, this is a lot of what I already mentioned, so you can just kind of go back and look at the pictures if you want to, and memorize where some of these are. So simple squamous, we already talked about. They're kind of flat cells, you can see, and they're great for areas that need quick diffusion of gases or other substances. So we're going to find it in alveoli and blood vessels we mentioned. Stratified squamous, we're going to find that mostly in the skin. We're going to find that in your mouth, in the cheeks, places that might get a lot of friction, have a lot of interaction with the external environment. Think about when you're chewing a tortilla chip, how much that scrapes the sides of your cheek. So you would want to have stratified epithelium there. So make sure you take some time to look over these locations and functions for each of these pictures, okay? And then we're going to use these pictures in lab or in class when we get together in person, and we're going to be looking at slides of these different tissues, and you can come back and use these pictures to help guide you through what you're seeing. Simple cuboidal epithelium, you can see here, these almost look, they're supposed to look square. They almost look more circular sometimes to me. Just depends on how you want to look at it. But you can see that they're not flat like the squamous, and they're not tall columns like columnar. They're kind of in between. And you're going to see that oftentimes in glands. Stratified cuboidal is kind of rare. We don't see it as often, but you might see it in some ducts. Simple columnar epithelium, we already talked about in the respiratory tract. You might see some in the gastrointestinal tract, in the renal tubules, you might find some. And so these are going to be tall. They're going to, if you're talking about the ones in the gastrointestinal tract or the ones in the renal tubules, they're going to have microvilli to help with absorption of material. Stratified columnar is going to be less common, but you will find it in some areas that you can see over there, over here. I'm just going to mention transitional epithelium so that you have, you've heard of it and you understand that it's kind of its own unique type of epithelium. It's found really in the urinary tract only, and particularly in the bladder. It's a type of epithelium that can change its shape. So when it's relaxed and not under pressure, it almost looks more like cuboidal. It's kind of balloon-shaped, more spherical. But when it gets stretched, it begins to flatten out, and it looks more like squamous epithelium. And so we couldn't really give it a name because sometimes it looks more cuboidal and sometimes it looks more squamous. So we gave it its own name called transitional. It's great for places like the bladder, for example, that when they're empty, they can kind of fill in the space by expanding their size, but when the bladder is full and there's a lot of pressure in there, they can kind of squish down into these flatter epithelial cells. So it works great for the glandular epithelial cells. These are cells that typically are going to produce some kind of substance. Maybe it's saliva, for example. Maybe it's some kind of an oily substance to help protect your hair or skin. And these epithelial cells are going to usually be surrounding some sort of duct, so that as they make their secretions, they can dump those secretions into the duct. And then the duct can carry the secretions either to the surface of the skin or to the inside of the mouth if we're talking about saliva. And we've got a couple of different types. You can have serous glands. Serous just means more of a watery solution versus mucus glands, which is going to be more of a sticky, thicker mucus type of secretion. And mucus cells are common throughout the body. In the lungs, we call mucus cells goblet cells. So that's on the exocrine side. Exocrine means that they're going to secrete their substance into the external environment. And that's opposed to endocrine secretions, which are not secreted into the external environment, but are secreted directly into the blood, and then they go around the body. So we're talking about things like hormones, things like insulin from the pancreas. Okay, so let's say we're talking about these epithelial cells that produce substances. They're going to produce hormones. They're going to produce oil to help keep your skin and your hair moistened. So once they make that substance and it's stored inside the epithelial cells, how does it get out? How does the mucus get out? How do the hormones get out? How does the oil get out of the cell? So that's what we're going to talk about here. There are three different ways in which these secretions can be released from the epithelial cells. If we want to look at an example here of salivary glands, for example, that are producing the saliva in your mouth right now. So they're going to produce the saliva, and you can see they're going to store it in these vesicles you see here. And when it's ready to be secreted, it's going to use something called the eccrine secretion. And in eccrine secretion, those vesicles just carry that substance, in this case saliva, to the apical side of the epithelial cell. The vesicles then merge with the plasma membrane, and the substances are released by exocytosis, which we've talked about previously. So you can see eccrine is going to use exocytosis through secretory vesicles. Some epithelial cells that produce substances that need to be released are going to do something called apocrine secretion, where basically they also store their substance in vesicles, and they move those vesicles to the apical side of the cell, and then the cell begins to pinch off on the apical surface until eventually it totally separates, and that top half of the cell can then release all of its secretions. So the example here is mammary glands and the cells that make milk, breast milk. This is how breast milk goes from the cells that make it into the ducts that then go to the nipple, so as the baby sucks, they can get the milk out of the tubes. So this is obviously different, where part of the cell is actually pinched off and removed in order to release the product. Now this is different from something called holocrine secretion. So apocrine, think of apocrine as apex. The top of the cell kind of pinches off and then releases its secretions. In holocrine, what we're going to find is that the whole cell, the entire cell, is going to be jam-packed with whatever secretion it's making, and it's going to burst itself. It's going to, the cell itself will completely burst, the whole cell, not just the top portion, but the whole cell. And as it does that, it will release whatever was stored inside. And then, of course, you've got to have stem cells down at the bottom that are, you can see here, replicating and dividing, and then they can become mature cells, and they can make more of the substance. In this case, we're talking about sebaceous glands, which produce oil for your skin and hair. And then once they've produced enough of that oil, then they will self-destruct and spill that oil into a tube, into a hair shaft, wherever it's needed. Excuse me. So make sure you make sure you understand the three different types of secretion, and that you have an example or two of each type of secretion. So glands themselves can also be classified according to the shape of the gland, and a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. So a simple tubular gland you can see here is exactly what it sounds like. It's just got one tube. You can have a simple coiled, simple again meaning one. It's still tubular, but that tube is now coiled. You can have a simple branched, so it starts out with one tube, but then it branches into more than one. You can have simple alveolar. Alveolar just means it ends in a sac. And then you can have simple branched alveolar, where you start with one, but then you end up branching off into several uh, blinded sacs. Then you can have compound glands, and so they're gonna be more than just one, right? So here you've got one, two, three, four, and each of them are doing their own type of branching. So you can have compound tubular, compound alveolar, or compound tubular alveolar. And I'm not going to have you guys, I'm not going to really test you over these. I just want you to be aware in case you see them in other classes that you understand that glands can be classified according to the way that they branch or according to their shape. Okay, next we'll talk about connective tissue. And connective tissue is also going to occur in several forms, just like epithelial tissue occurred in several forms. So what makes connective tissue unique is what it's composed of. And all connective tissue, and we're going to see quite a wide range of connective tissue, everything from something that looks liquid like blood to something that looks very solid like bone. All of it's going to be included in this category of connective tissue. So what makes connective tissue are these three things. There needs to be specialized cells, and we'll discuss what each specialized cell is in every type of connective tissue we look at. There has to be a ground substance, or what a lot of times people will call matrix. Matrix is kind of the combination of these two. There needs to be some kind of a liquid, but there also are typically some kind of extracellular protein fibers. So, for example, when we talk about tendons and ligaments, there's going to be collagen and other types of elastic fibers that are going to be part of this matrix. This everything that's not a cell will be combined in the matrix, and that matrix is going to be composed of protein fibers and ground substance. So depending on the connective tissue that we're talking about, it may have quite a variety of functions. Some of them will function to just provide structural framework. If we think of bone, for example, that's just giving your body a framework. Some of them will be used to transport materials such as blood and lymph. Some of them are going to protect organs such as capsules that surround the liver and the spleen and the kidneys. Some of them will store energy in the form of lipids, so fat cells, what we call adipocytes. That's a type of connective tissue as well. And some of them will defend the body. Some of them will actually have immune cells as part of their makeup, and that's going to help to protect the body. So we'll look at several of these, and we'll see the functions as we go. We can look at connective tissue in three basic groupings. We can talk about connective tissue proper, and that's what we typically think of with connective tissue. We think of kind of the stretchy but tough material that holds stuff together. So things like tendons and ligaments, for example, and capsules. These are all connective tissue proper, and we'll talk about dense forms of that, like ligaments, and we'll talk about looser forms of that, like reticular tissue. So we'll look at some from both. You can then have fluid connective tissue, and that's going to be blood and lymph. We won't talk a lot about it in this chapter because we're going to have a separate chapter on blood, but just know that it's included in the connective tissues. And then you can have supporting connective tissue. So that's going to be the firmer connective tissues like bone and cartilage. And we'll talk a little bit about bone and cartilage now, but we're going to have a separate chapter on bone and the skeletal system, so we'll talk more about bone when we get to that system. So let's look at connective tissue proper. And remember, every connective tissue has cells, has protein fibers, and has some kind of a fluid or ground substance we call that makes it up. And so for each of these connective tissues that we go through, we're going to look at what are the specialized cells, what are the protein fibers and what is the ground substance. So when we're looking at connective tissue proper, the fixed cells, there's several of them, and I just want to go through them because you're going to kind of hear them as we go along. Remember we talked about how a lot of tissues have stem cells, meaning they're cells that retain the ability to divide and replicate. Well, when we're talking about connective tissue and we want to talk about the stem cells that are in connective tissue that kind of refresh or make new connective tissue cells, we'll talk about mesenchymal cells. Fibroblasts and fibrocytes. So you can think of fibro like fibrous, like fibers, and blasts is always going to be immature, or the ones that are kind of producing the mature cells. And then remember, cyte is going to be the mature cell. So we're going to see fibroblasts and we're going to see fibrocytes. We'll see some macrophages as we go along. Macrophages are a type of immune cell that are often the first line of defense because they're embedded in connective tissues, like, say, in the skin, for example. So if you get a cut or a scrape and you have an opening in your skin and bacteria begin to enter, they're going to encounter these fixed macrophages that will eat those bacteria and will kind of trigger the rest of the immune system. Adipocytes, or some people say adipocytes, these are going to be fat cells pretty much. They're just going to store lipids, and so they're going to be a source of energy for us. And then melanocytes we've already talked about. We didn't talk about melanocytes yet. We'll talk about them in more detail when we get to skin. But they produce melanin, which gives our skin color and protects us from ultraviolet radiation. You can also have some cells in the connective tissue that are going to be what we call wandering. It means they're not kind of held in one place, but they're able to move through that ground substance and move around. And a lot of these are immune cells. So we had fixed macrophages. They're kind of stuck where they are, but they do the same thing as free macrophages. It's just the free ones are able to move around. Mast cells, we'll talk about this more when we get to immune cells. They're going to stimulate inflammation. They're going to be part of the allergic response. Lymphocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, these are cells that are going to be involved with the immune response. I'm just introducing these terms here, but we'll have a separate chapter on blood, and we'll talk about a lot of these cells then. Okay, so just give you an example of what we're talking about. When we talk about connective tissue having specialized cells, having protein fibers, and having ground substance, this is a picture showing you what we mean. So specialized cells, you can see several. There's adipocytes there, there's mast cells, there's macrophages, there's a mesenchymal cell. So you can see there's specialized cells in this tissue. You can see the fibers. There's two kinds of fibers here. They're showing you collagen fibers here in the yellow, and they're showing you elastic fibers here in the black. And then the rest of the space, excuse me, what's colored pink here in the picture, that's the ground substance. That's the kind of more liquidy part of the connective tissue. And when I say liquidy, it doesn't always mean water. Sometimes the ground substance does have water in it, but it has other minerals, or it has so many proteins within it that it ends up thickening and being more like molasses or syrup. Sometimes it has so many minerals that it ends up being hard, like in bone, for example. So you see those three components: specialized cells, protein fibers, and ground substance. And we're going to look at some pictures under the microscope in class, so you're going to want to kind of come back to this picture here in reference. You can see the red there. Those are the collagen fibers. You can see kind of the wispy strands of elastic fibers in there. You can see some specialized cells, and then the kind of yellowish color, that's the ground substance. Okay, so let's look at, so we were looking at some of the cells, right? So for each kind of connective tissue, we're going to separate it into what cells are there, and then we're going to look at what protein fibers are there, and then we may say a word about the ground substance. So when we're looking at connective tissue proper, we looked at the cells already. Now we're going to look at the fibers. So what kind of fibers might we find in connective tissue proper? Well, probably the most important one, if you don't remember any of the others, and you should remember the others, but if you can't, and you can only remember one, you should remember collagen fibers. These are the most abundant, the most common fibers found in connective tissue proper. They're also the strongest, and they're strong because they're triple threaded, meaning they are three strands of protein fibers wound together. Think of a rope that has three pieces of rope braided together, how strong that rope will be because of the three strands that are braided together. So we're going to find collagen in areas that require quite a bit of strength. So, for example, in tendons and ligaments, holding bones together and holding muscles to bone. There are then reticular fibers, and these are more mesh-like, almost like a net of fibers. They're going to be very thin, and their purpose really is more for flexibility, to help with stretching and twisting, to give some flexibility to tissues. And we're going to find them in places like the liver and the spleen, which have a very unique feel to them as organs. And partly it's because of these reticular fibers. They're a lot more malleable, a lot more squishy, so to speak. Then elastic fibers, these are really important because we want our tissue to be strong, especially let's say we're talking about ligaments or tendons. We want them to be strong, so we need the collagen, but we also want them to have a little bit of springiness to them, a little bit of stretchability to them. And these elastic fibers give us that springiness or that stretchiness to those otherwise very tough tissues. Now, the connective tissue proper ground substance is composed of these three substances here. You don't have to memorize those, just know that it's a combination of proteins and sugars and water, and it's got kind of that maple syrup consistency that I was talking of. It's thicker than water, but it's still fluid. It's still able to allow, for example, macrophages and neutrophils and other cells to kind of move in and out in between the fibers. And it's helpful because it provides lubrication. So, for example, if we're talking about ligaments or tendons, we don't necessarily want them to be completely dry when they're rubbing against bone. We like there to be some moisture. It provides some compression because of the fluid that's there. So if there's some stress placed on that joint, for example, we like there to be a little bit of shock absorption, and the fluid in the ground substance helps that as well. Okay, so if we come back to this chart, we can see that we talked about connective tissue proper, and we can see that there's kind of loose and there's dense. So if we look at loose connective tissue proper, this is going to be, it's not going to be the dense kind of thick stuff like ligaments and tendons. This is going to be kind of looser connective tissue. Think of it as cushion, things to kind of absorb force and shock as our body kind of moves around and organs get sloshed around, or skin gets compressed. So this kind of tissue is really going to fill space between organs so that there's not empty space. It's going to provide some cushioning. It might be underlying support for epithelia, something for the epithelia to attach to. Something that's really important about this type of tissue is that it becomes kind of support for blood vessels and nerves. So you think of every nerve pretty much has to come from your spinal cord to the rest of your body. And in order to get there, it has to travel through chest and abdomen and arms and legs and fingers and toes. And it has to have something to travel through. So this loose connective tissue proper is where a lot of these blood vessels and nerves are traveling through onto their final destination. It also stores lipids. So we talked about those adipocytes that were storing fat. So we're going to find one type of loose connective tissue is called adipose tissue, and that's the one that's storing lipids. Areolar tissue, this is kind of like our subcutaneous tissue that we talked about, and then we'll talk briefly about reticular tissue. Areolar tissue, this is really around for cushion, kind of shock absorbing padding you might think of. It's got a lot of ground substance, so it's largely composed of that kind of maple syrup type consistency of fluid. There's some elastic fibers in there to help it stretch and spring back. Think about it with your skin, for example. It's what's in between your skin and your muscle, for example. So if your skin just attached directly to the underlying muscle, there wouldn't be much of a barrier for shock absorption. You wouldn't have the flexibility that you have because you have this very loose connective tissue in between the two layers. So here's just a representative for you to show areolar tissue. You can see that it's got a lot of ground substance if you look at the kind of that yellow color. There's also, again, some collagen fibers. There's some elastic fibers. And then, of course, there's some of these cells like fibrocytes and macrophages that we came to know in the earlier part of the lecture. And you can see some areas here. It's quite prominent. It's in lots of places. I always just remember it deep to the dermis of the skin. So like subcutaneous tissue is a type of areolar tissue. But it's found in lots of areas. Subcutaneous tissue, as I mentioned before, is important because it has a good blood supply. Remember I was talking about how this type of loose connective tissue can carry blood vessels. And because of that, it becomes a good place for the absorption of some medicines. And I mentioned this earlier. Actually, no, it'll come up again in the skin lecture. Sorry, I already recorded that lecture, and so it feels like I've already given it to you. But we'll talk about giving some medicines into the subcutaneous space, and the two common ones are insulin, which is for diabetics, and then heparin, which is a blood thinner. Another type of loose connective tissue is adipose tissue. We're going to look at this in class together under the microscope. You can see, look at how flat, here's the actual cell, right? And then all that space, that's all fat that's kind of being stored inside that cell. And so fatty tissue keeps us warm. Fatty tissue stores lipids for energy. Fatty tissue gives us cushion. So there's a lot of benefits to it. Of course, if you have too much fatty tissue, then there's complications from that as well. There's two types of fat. Really, in adults, we're only talking about one type of fat, and that's what we would call white fat, and that's what's pictured here. Newborns and very young infants have another kind of fat that's called brown fat, and it can be burned to produce heat in newborns. But after the newborn period, really, we don't have much brown fat left. The last type of loose connective tissue that I wanted to talk about was reticular. And this is a type of supportive tissue. We're going to, I don't know if we'll see, we might see this under the microscope. I'm not sure. I think we have some slides of this in the lab. But this type of tissue is more like a stretchy, supportive network for organs, especially liver, spleen, and lymph nodes you can see there. And you can see it's heavy on the elastic tissue. If you look at the picture on the microscope, you can see all of the black strands. That's all that elastic tissue that we looked at. And so that gives a lot of stretchability for these particular organs. All right, so that was connective tissue proper. We're not really going to talk much about fluid connective tissue because we'll see that more in the future, but we have some supporting connective tissue to talk as well. Oh, I guess we mentioned dense connective tissue, but didn't go into detail. Let's look at, this is going to give us some pictures of things like ligaments and tendons that I mentioned earlier. Connective tissue proper, we already looked at kind of the loose, this is the dense. The difference between the two, one of the big differences between the two of them is What makes it dense is you have a lot of these protein fibers, so a lot of collagen, for example, in tendons and ligaments, and that doesn't leave as much room for things like ground substance. So there's very little ground substance here, and its main purpose is to provide strength um, from being ripped or stretched. If you just think of ligaments that attach bones together or tendons that attach muscles to bone, you need a very strong connection there to withstand, the stretching and movement of the human body. There's two types, dense regular and dense irregular. If we look at dense regular, that's going to be the things that we typically think of, things like tendons that I was talking about. So they are going to attach muscles to bone. Aponeuroses, I just want to introduce you to the term. It's kind of like a tendon. It's very similar to a tendon, but it kind of is thinner and broader than a tendon. Tendons tend to come from a muscle, and they kind of tend to come down. So if you've got a muscle here, the tendons tend to get more narrow and get very concentrated, very dense at the place where they attach to the bone. Aponeuroses kind of come off, and they kind of, in a broader way, might attach to maybe another muscle, for example. So they're not quite as pinpoint and strong. They're a little bit thinner and more fanned out, more superficial. But they're made of pretty much the same material. You can see here, and we'll see the same picture when we look at slides under the microscope in the lab. But you can see how densely packed all of these collagen fibers are. There's almost no space, not even for ground substance, but there's almost no space for these fibroblasts, which are making the collagen fibers. They're just kind of squished anywhere they can fit in between collagen fibers. There are some tissues that need a little bit more elasticity, so there's still going to be a dense form of connective tissue proper, but because they require a little bit more elasticity, you're going to have just a little bit less collagen, and you're going to replace that collagen with elastic fibers. So that's important for ligaments. So for example, as let's say if any of you have ever sprained your ankle, and not really bad, but kind of a mild sprain, your bones were able to kind of stretch and move and even displace a little bit and then snap back to their original position because that ligament that held the bones together was able to stretch with the force, but then had enough elasticity that it could kind of spring back and pull the bones back into their proper position. Now, of course, you can apply too much force and you can tear those ligaments, and then you've got a worse sprain. But for the most part, ligaments do a good job of allowing a little bit of flexibility but providing quite a bit of strength. Dense or regular connective tissue does not doesn't have the. We're used to seeing collagen fibers kind of like this. We've been looking at ligaments and tendons, for example, right? And they kind of been in parallel. Well, this one is going to have collagen fibers that are not in parallel. They're going to be at various angles to each other. And what this does is it reduces the overall strength. I mean, if they're running parallel, you're going to have more strength in one direction, in the direction that the fibers are aligned. So putting the collagen fibers at different angles does reduce the overall strength, but the benefit is that it gives you strength in multiple directions that you don't get with the dense regular connective tissue. So you can see here in the picture how these collagen fibers are going, right? Some are going this way, some are going this way, some are going this way, some are going this way. So you're getting strength from stretching in multiple directions. That's kind of the purpose of it. And you're going to see this in the linings of bones and the lining of cartilage, so the periosteum and the perichondrium. We'll talk about that when we get there. organ capsules, so the lining of the liver, for example, the spleen, the kidneys, joint capsules, and also the sheaths around nerves and blood vessels. As they run through that areolar tissue that we talked about, they're usually encased in this type of connective tissue to kind of keep it protected. Okay, so we've talked about connective tissue proper, we talked about loose and dense, and now we'll talk about supporting connective tissue. As I mentioned, blood will get its own lecture. So I'll just show one slide here on blood, but we're not really going to talk a lot about it. The plasma, the liquid part of blood, that's the ground substance. The specialized cells are red cells, white cells, platelets, and so forth. There's not as much protein fibers, but there are proteins floating in the plasma. Lymph is going to be fluid, kind of whatever's left behind in a capillary bed after the blood moves in to the tissues and nutrients move into the tissues and the bad stuff moves back into the capillaries. Sometimes there's leftover fluid, and the lymph system is going to collect that fluid and carry it eventually back to the heart. The cells found in that connective tissue, the lymph, are mostly white blood cells that help with immune function. Okay, so on to supporting supporting connective tissue. We're not going to talk a lot about bone, only because we're going to have a whole separate section on bone, so we'll spend most of our time here on supportive connective tissue, talking about cartilage. So the fibers there are largely collagen. There is some chondroitin sulfate. That's kind of it gives the cartilage kind of a thicker feel than some of the other connective tissues that we've seen so far. The specialized cells are called chondrocytes. So remember we talked about that we would look at specialized cells, we would look at protein fibers, and we would look at ground substance for each connective tissue. So in here, the fibers are largely collagen, the specialized cells are chondrocytes, and the ground substance contains this chondroitin sulfate, which makes it a little bit thicker, a little bit firmer. Now, because that ground substance is firm, the cells are not really free to move around or roam around. So the specialized cells that we're calling chondrocytes have to have a home. They have to have a place where they stay and where they can produce this extracellular matrix, the collagen fibers and the ground substance. And so they're going to live in places called lacunae. So you can see here, this, for example, would be lacunae. This would be lacunae. This would be a lacunae. So they're kind of cut out areas in the ground substance that allow these cells to produce their substances. The other thing to know about, so you want to learn that term, lacunae. The other thing about cartilage is it's not vascular, it's avascular. That means there really isn't a good blood supply to cartilage. Now this becomes important clinically if cartilage is injured. It does not heal well, because in order to heal, you have to bring cells that can produce healing. You have to bring blood cells, for example, white blood cells that can help with healing. And without a blood supply, you really don't get healing of cartilage. So those are very difficult parts of the body to heal if they get injured. And I mentioned already earlier that there's something called a perichondrium. Think of the word peri as being around or surrounding. And this term chondro is the kind of stem word for cartilage, right? We have chondroblasts, we have chondrocytes, we have the perichondrium. So the perichondrium is a connective tissue sheath that kind of surrounds or covers cartilage. So chondroblasts that you see here, those would be kind of the immature chondrocytes. So they're going to produce chondrocytes. They're also going to help produce the ground substance. Cartilage grows in two different ways. Cartilage can grow kind of from the outside and expand outward. Um, and then cartilage can also grow from the inside of the cartilage. So if the cartilage is growing kind of from the outside, from the perichondrium outward, we're going to call that appositional growth that you see there. If the cartilage is growing from the inside, then we would call that interstitial growth. So there's two different kinds. Appositional is kind of growth from the outside. Interstitial is growth from the inside. Excuse me. Can't get rid of this cough. So if you look, for example, at the appositional growth, you can see that we're kind of starting here. The perichondrium, right, is on the outside. It's what surrounds the cartilage. And just below that perichondrium, you have chondroblasts. And these are the ones that are going to kind of form new chondrocytes. So they're going to start to replicate and divide. And you're going to get growth of the cartilage from the outside versus the one down here is kind of showing you chondrocytes within the matrix itself dividing, replicating, and causing growth from the inside. So there are three primary types of cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, this is the cartilage that you'll find between the tips of the ribs and the bones of the sternum, for example. You'll find it covering the joint surfaces of a lot of joints. So this is kind of showing you the shoulder joint, and covering the shoulder joint, the cartilage there is hyaline cartilage. It's also part of your voice box, the trachea, the bronchi, and the part of the flexible part of your nose. So this is stiff but still somewhat flexible support. When it's in the joints especially, it's going to help reduce friction between the bony surfaces. And you can see kind of what it looks like here. You can see the lacunae, you can see the chondrocytes inside the lacunae, and then you can see this kind of gelatinous ground substance surrounding the lacunae. Elastic cartilage is going to be a bit more bendable than the hyaline cartilage that we looked at in the previous slide. So you're going to find that in places like your ear that's quite bendable. Parts of your the epiglottis that covers your esophagus, parts of your ear canal will also be formed from this elastic cartilage. And you can see here, whereas in the previous picture we had lacunae like we do here with our chondrocytes inside, we had pretty much all the ground substance was kind of homogeneous. It all looked the same, right? We didn't have these kind of strands of elastic fibers flowing through. Here you can see multiple elastic fibers running through this cartilage, and that's what helps this type of cartilage be more stretchy, be able to be distorted and return to its original shape. So elastic cartilage, you might not be surprised, has more elastic fibers. And then lastly is going to be fibrous cartilage. This is going to be pretty tough cartilage. It's not going to want to move as much, but it is going to help absorb some of the shock. So, for example, in your knee joint, let's say you're running and you're putting a lot of pressure from your weight every time you run and you land and you compress your knee together. This kind of cartilage, fibrous cartilage, is in your menisci in your knee joint, and that acts as a shock absorber. So this is kind of a tougher, firmer, shock absorbing type of cartilage. It's also the cartilage that's in the discs in between your vertebrae, which can take a lot of weight. Again, if you're jumping, if you're running, even when you're walking, and those bones would want to smash together, those vertebrae are in between the bones and provide some shock absorption. Bone we'll just mention briefly, but we're going to have a whole another lecture on bone. So the kind of anatomical term for bone is osseous tissue. So we're going to you're going to hear that root word osseous several times. You're going to have osteocytes and osteoblasts and periosteum. And the ground substance in bone is quite hard. So whereas in blood it's almost water-like, and in connective tissue proper it's like maple syrup, and cartilage it gets a little bit more form because of the chondroitin sulfate. By the time we get to bone, that ground substance is very, very firm, very hard. It's actually become mineralized from calcium deposits. We still have osteocytes housed within lacunae, just like we did in the cartilage, where we had chondrocytes housed in lacunae. And we're going to see that they can communicate with each other because that ground substance is so firm. There's no way to move things around that matrix. There have to be a series of tunnels that help lacunae talk to each other, communicate with each other. And just as the cartilage was surrounded by a capsule that we call the perichondrium, here we have a surrounding to the bone called the periosteum. And we'll see that there's two different kinds of bone, compact and spongy. Work our way through the body. There are membranes on the inside of pretty much all of the openings to the world. So this would be mouth, nose, vagina, anus, where it needs to kind of remain moist. It's kind of a slippery, sticky, mucousy layer of epithelial cells, and so we call that mucosa or a mucous membrane. And as I mentioned within the epithelial section, these membranes are really there for protection. And you can see I kind of mentioned where you might find those. Serous membranes are going to be a little bit less sticky, a little bit less mucousy, but they're still going to provide some lubrication. That's kind of their primary purpose. So when we talk about the lining of the lungs, the lining of the heart, things like that, those linings are going to be composed of what we would call a serous membrane, kind of a slippery, thin, almost transparent membrane that covers some of our organs to keep friction down, to reduce friction. Cutaneous membrane, that's really your skin. So that obviously is more for protection. It prevents everything in our atmosphere from landing on our skin and getting into our body. It also helps regulate temperature, prevents dehydration, but we'll talk more about that in the next chapter when we discuss skin separately. Synovial membranes, you'll hear this a lot. These are the membranes that line joints. And so they usually produce a fluid that kind of gets in the joint space and helps with shock absorption, helps reduce friction of bone on cartilage and things like that. So these synovial membranes are quite important. Now, occasionally they get irritated, they overproduce their fluid, and you might get a swollen joint, if you've ever had a swollen knee or a swollen elbow from some kind of an injury or overuse. That's the synovial membranes producing too much fluid in response to the injury. Fascia is another type of connective tissue. We talk about fascia normally in relationship to muscles. So fascia will separate, for example, muscle from subcutaneous tissue. Fascia will separate superficial muscles from deeper muscles. And it's kind of a tough membrane that protects the muscle. Clinically, it's useful if you're doing surgery because it's so tough. It's actually a lot tougher than the muscle itself, that you can actually stick sutures into the fascia and kind of anchor your sutures for whatever it is that you're going to sew. If you kind of put it into the fascia, it's nice and thick. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to muscles and we talk about different compartments, superficial muscles versus deeper muscles. Often they're separated into compartments by fascia. The fascia becomes kind of a lining and creates these different compartments of muscle. And we'll talk about that more once we get into the muscle chapter. A brief overview of muscle. Again, we're going to have more in-depth discussion of muscle but I wanted to introduce the three kinds of muscle, what's similar, what's different. So there's three types of muscle. The first one we'll look at is skeletal muscle. That's also called striated voluntary. Voluntary because pretty much skeletal muscle responds to our conscious efforts of movement. So we think that we want to walk, and so we contract the muscles that help us walk, or we think that we want to grab a pencil, so we reach down and we grab it. So it's voluntary. It's striated, we'll see, because of the way that the fibers are laid out. When you look under the microscope, it actually looks striped, and that's where that term striated comes from. Now, striated voluntary muscle will require stimulation by a nerve in order to contract. It's not able to contract on its own. Another unique thing about striated voluntary muscle or skeletal muscle is that it's multinucleated. And I mentioned that in the cellular anatomy chapter, that there were some cells like skeletal muscle that each cell has multiple nuclei in it, and this is one of them. The stem cells in muscle are going to be called myosatellite cells. So we talked about how each tissue has its own type of stem cell. So myosatellite cells are the muscle stem cells. And then muscle growth and muscle atrophy, or the loss of muscle bulk, really has more to do with the proteins that are present inside the muscle cells. So this is what I mean by striated. If you look under the microscope, it actually looks striped. And we're going to see why when we get to the muscle chapter. We'll talk about what produces, excuse me, those stripes there. Cardiac muscle is kind of unique. It is also striped, just like skeletal muscle, but it is involuntary, so it's something that we don't think about, right? Right now, as you're listening to this lecture, none of you are telling your heart consciously beat, beat, beat every second. It's doing it involuntarily. And what's interesting, we'll find out more in physiology, is that there is no nervous system input required for your heart to contract. It can contract on its own. And that's quite unique to cardiac muscle. Excuse me. Another interesting thing about cardiac muscle is that there are no stem cells. There's no myosatellite cells. And this is a problem. So if we go back to skeletal muscle, let's say I tore my muscle. Let's say I lifted something too heavy and I ripped my muscle. Well, there are myosatellite cells that can produce new muscle cells, and I can repair that tear, and I can make new muscle, and eventually it'll be good as new. Well, in the heart, you don't have those myosatellite cells. You don't have those stem cells. So you have no way to restore damaged heart cells. And so when you damage heart muscle, it's gone for good. So when you have a heart attack, it's such a serious issue because once the muscle's dead, you can't get it back. You can't repair it. You can't save it or bring it back. It's gone. Cardiac muscle has a single nucleus, unlike skeletal muscle, and it has a very interesting way of communicating through something called intercalated discs, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the chapter. So you can see a picture here. It also still looks striped. You can see the stripes. They look a little more faint here. But these are the intercalated discs that I was talking about. See them there? They show up. And this is how one muscle cell communicates with another muscle cell. The third type of muscle is smooth muscle. This is basically organ muscle, so outside of the heart, which gets its own specialized muscle. So like the muscle inside the intestines that help your intestines contract, the muscles in your bronchioles that help them constrict, the muscles in the blood vessels that help them dilate and constrict. These are non-striated. They are not striped under the microscope, and they are also involuntary, just like heart muscle is. They have a single nucleus, also like heart muscle. And we'll encounter smooth muscle as we get into some of the other organ systems. You can see here what it looks like. No stripes like we saw on the other pictures, so this is non-striated or this is smooth. And there's only one nucleus per cell. Lastly here, just for completeness sake, I put nervous tissue. We're not going to go into it because we're going to have a separate chapter on nervous tissue. So for this one, I want you to mainly focus on epithelial tissue, the different types of connective tissue, know some of the similarities and differences in broad strokes of the different types of muscle tissue, but we'll go into more depth in muscle and nervous tissue later on.